It's week 2 of our pathway of loving God with all of our soul. Last week we looked at how we live that out by loving God, by spending time with God, by deepening that relationship that we have with God, and recognizing the gift of the presence of God in our lives. This week we focus in on loving God through loving others. And it might be helpful to remember that when Jesus gave us the great commandment and said, love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, he immediately followed that up with, and something else that is almost the same is to love others and to love self. So how do we love God by loving others is the focus of our time today and this week. So, I want to begin by throwing out the two sides of the coin here. The fact that loving others is incredibly complicated. What a daunting task for us as human beings to find ways to connect with one another and ways to build the relationship. And then the other side of that coin is, and yet it is so simple. It really is. It is a simple thing to find a way to connect. It is a simple thing to be in relationship because we actually already are before we even meet that person. So let's spend some time this week exploring these two things and connecting them to our love of God. First of all, the fact that it's incredibly complicated. I'll confess to you that I am a person who does not easily make connections with other people. It is difficult for me to meet somebody and to find connections with them and then to sustain those connections. And so it's funny for me to be a person who's trying to encourage and coach other people into being in better relationship with others, because that is one of my growing edges. I know it, I claim it. It's just difficult. It's not that I don't want to be in relationship with other people. It's just that I find it so incredibly scary on some level, because to be in a relationship with other people means to put ourselves out there. And when we do that, we of course run the risk of being judged or being abused or taken advantage of in some way. If I'm going to extend love to you and you don't extend love to me in equal measure, that can be a very scary and intimidating thing for people. So scary and intimidating, in fact, that oftentimes we choose not to try at all. And so I just confess, and I give every credit to those who are able to more easily create relationships and connections with other people. So perhaps you are someone who also finds it very difficult to enter into relationship with others. That's completely understandable, and you probably have very good reasons for your reluctance. And then on this other hand is the fact that being in relationship with people oftentimes is incredibly simple and doesn't require a lot of us. What it requires is not that we add something, that we put on a face or a facade, but that we simply find ways to set aside all those things that would seek to separate us from one another. And so being in relationship with others oftentimes requires us to set aside and suspend our judgments of them, set aside and suspend our stereotypes of groups of people, to set aside and suspend our own agendas, whatever it might be that we're wanting out of this encounter or this relationship, to set that aside and let it be what it will be. So we have these two competing sides to loving others: the fact that it's incredibly hard and the fact that it's the simplest thing in the world, because we're already in the one family of God with these people. And whatever other kind of distinctions we might come up with, they pale in comparison to the fact that we are are created by God, that we are a part of a family, and that our relationship with one another is already that of brother and sister, brother and brother, sister and sister. One interesting kind of example of the ways that it is both incredibly difficult and simple to be in relationship with one another. It was a funny story. The first time Nicole Kidman appeared on the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, they were recalling the first time that they met and how they didn't quite hit it off. And the reason was that they both came at that encounter with completely different expectations and understandings of what was going on. Jimmy remembers the story such that their mutual friend called him up one day and said, "Hey, you may not believe it, but I'm here with Nicole Kidman, and she would like to come over and meet you." And Jimmy all of a sudden got very nervous, and he understood that, perhaps it was in connection with her interest in him being in one of her movies. So she came over to his house. He was a poor host. He admitted it. He didn't quite put his best foot forward, and nothing became of their encounter. Nicole, on the other hand, had a different thing in mind. She was coming over to Jimmy's house to meet him because she was romantically interested in him, and she wanted a chance to try to get to know him in that way. And the whole time she's wondering, what's going on here? There just must be no chemistry. Perhaps he's not interested in me. He invited her to, hang out and play video games, apparently more than they had any kind of real conversation. She said after about an hour and a half, she said, oh well, and just kind of excused herself. Well, Jimmy didn't realize that was what had happened that day until she came on the show and explained it to him. And he was dumbfounded. He was shocked. He was embarrassed. He just couldn't believe that he had missed the opportunity to be in a relationship with Nicole Kidman. I think that kind of thing happens to us all the time. I'm not even talking about romantic relationships here. I'm talking about just the potential for any kind of relationship. We miss cues, we miss opportunities, oftentimes because, just like with Jimmy, our preconception and our fear and anxiety gets in the way of allowing a relationship to develop, which could develop quite naturally if we could find a way to set those hang-ups aside. Just as it is difficult to find ways to get in a relationship with God because of all of the hang-ups that we have, so it is with others. And I think that's why God says you can love me by loving others. Because when we love one another, we strengthen the family of God. We take part of the creation that God loves, which is strained, which is in some way separated, and we find ways to bring it together. That is what relationship does. That is the gift of love. It brings us together. Whether that love be romantic love, whether that love be the love of family or the love of friendship, in some way it serves to bring us together, to reassemble the whole. And that is, of course, God, the whole of all creation, of all that is. And so we love God by seeking to build those bridges and make those connections with other people. And when we express love to others, we are in fact expressing love to God as well. So this week, we're going to spend some time thinking about the two sides of this coin, about how on one hand it is so incredibly difficult and how many obstacles there are. So you think about what those obstacles are for you. What are the things that stand in the way of you entering into genuine loving relationships with other people? And then give some credence to the fact that actually it is so simple that the only thing that complicates it is us. It is the thing, the hang-ups and the preconceptions that we bring. And when we can let those go, actually what we have here is a very natural, easy process of being in relationship and in falling in love with one another. the last thought that I want to leave us with is something that's been on my mind for quite some time, and I recently heard a pastor give a moving sermon on this too. It was a Christmas Eve sermon, and that is the dangerous nature of the phrase "those people." In fact, I think that might be the most dangerous phrase in all of human language, "those people," because what it does is it creates a world in which we exist independently of one another, separately of one another. That phrase, "those people," opens the door to us building up all kinds of camps, all kinds of different cliques, of different groups, of different identities that seek to take the place of our true identity of being children in the family of God with one another. So I want to throw that out there as food for thought, that it may well be worth our while to try and set that concept and that phrase aside and expunge it from our own mentality and our own speaking. That phrase, "those people." Find ways in which you are connected and start from there, recognizing the difference that may exist, but at the same time living fully and leaning fully into the fact that we are mutually bound with one another. Both those that we have known and loved for years and those who are complete strangers to us. We should be in love with one another because we are both born out of the same love, the love that God has for us. That is how we can return that love to God, by finding ways to build up our relationships with one another. So this week, let's give some real attention to that. Finding ways that we can seek to more fully live into love for every person that we meet.